Welcome everybody to Math in a Matter of Minutes. You see my play on alliteration there. Here are some warm-up and practice videos with regard to our current unit that we're working on. It's Unit 8, relating fractions, decimals, and money. Now, the students are familiar with the fraction form. Now, we will be talking about fractions in the terms of denominators of 10 and 100 only. We are not doing percentages, even though you do use decimals to get into percentages, so it is a building block for something the students will be doing in the future. But a part of our standard states that they understand how fractions are related to decimals and how they're both related to money. So again, we will be working with fractions in the terms fractions with denominators of 10 or 100. Those will be the only two denominators. And we need to understand how that's related to our place value chart, which again is building upon what we've done in previous work. So, like I said, the children are familiar with fractions, and now we're moving on to decimals. So we're going to start off with the place value chart, which is definitely a good strategy to help you change fractions into decimals. So previously what the students had learned is, and I'm going to go ahead and draw it out because this was asked of them to do that as well in their notebook, so they should be familiar. So we learned the 10,000s, the thousands, the hundreds, the tens, and the ones. This is what we did at the beginning of the year when we talked about place value. And I believe we actually we might have even gone up to 100,000. So let me go ahead and add that just so that it is consistent with what our previous learning was. So we've got our 100,000s, 10,000s, thousands, hundreds, tens, and ones. We are adding something new, and this is our decimals. We are adding a decimal point. A decimal represents part of a whole. So it's the same thing as a fraction. It represents part of whole, and we represent it with a decimal. Now, normally we don't write it that big. This is just for dramatization, so that the children understand where a decimal goes. So we have all of our whole numbers, and if we're talking about money, this would be all of our bills. And then we have our decimal point, and then we have our decimals, which represent part of a whole piece. So here we have our tenths, and here we have our hundredths. Now, in contrast to our whole numbers, they go from right to left, getting bigger. So the thing on the far left is the biggest. With our decimals, we go from left to right, with the thing on the left also being the biggest, but the numbers look bigger as they go away. See, this says hundredths because that's a hundredth of a whole. That's a tenth of a whole. So this is something the students had to put in their notebook, and I even had them write it out. Like I labeled it here. We wrote 100,000s, 10,000s, thousands, hundreds, tens, ones, tenths, and hundredths. And so I think some of the confusion that some students get is because that's tenths, they confuse tens and tenths, and hundreds and hundredths. But if we remember that with the THS means part of a whole, THS, part of a whole. So that would go after the decimal point, and the others go before the decimal point. All right, so the first unit that we learned, which was Unit 9.1, the essential question for 9.1 was how can you record tenths as fractions and decimals. So let's go ahead and write that here. EQ, how can you record tenths as fractions and decimals. Now, just so you understand what the kids do, they always write the essential question, then we go through, we talk about any new vocabulary in there, what is the math and what are we doing. So we definitely have some new vocabulary with the word tenths, and we know fractions, and we have this new vocabulary with decimals. So what we would have done in the lesson is the children would have written down the definition of tenths. They would have written down the definition of decimals. So they would know that the tenths is the first place value to the right of the decimal point. So we always put everything in perspective to our decimal point. It's either to the left or it's to the right. So tenths is the first place value. Tenths is the first, and I'm going to put PV for place value. The children know what that means. Place value to the right of the decimal point. All right, so tenths is the first place value to the right of the decimal point. And then decimals, we would have also written that down. And decimals represents part of a whole. So it's just another way. It is the same. It means the same as fractions. It's just another representation. So it's part of a whole. Part of a whole. And the children will really get a better understanding of this once we get into the actual money part. Now, we don't talk about money today because we're talking about tenths. And remember, money has to be written in hundredths form. We'll get into that in our next lesson. So we talked about that vocabulary. And then we are going to talk about some different ways to look at it. So we have a model, and I'm going to go ahead and draw out the model in here. And obviously, since we're talking about tenths, our denominator should be 10. Creating a tenths model, so I'm going to split it in half and then split each of these into 5. All right, that's about as best I could do there. So we have our model here, and I'm going to color in some of those. So all right, so we have our model, and we know that our whole box represents our denominator. So we have 1, 2, and I'll go ahead and label it down here just so you can see kind of how the kids do this and they get a better understanding. But also this can be a little reminder for the kids how we do this. So our whole model represents 10 spaces. So our denominator is 10 because our whole model is our denominator. And then how many are colored in represents our numerator. So that's 1, that's 2. I probably should use the lighter color. 2, and that's 3. So our numerator is 3. So our fraction or our model represented in a fraction form. So this is the model form, this is the fraction form. And now what we're going to do is we are going to also take this and put it into decimal form. Now, this is the trick that I teach the kids. Obviously it says tenths. Since it's a fraction, it would go in the tenths place. Using your place value chart, that's how you would do it. Now, we don't have time to always draw this out. Now, a kid can definitely draw that out really quickly at the beginning of a test, and it should be real easy for them. But we have to, you don't want to always have to draw something out. So, what I tell the children, you look at it, if it's anything with 10 with a 1 and a 0, you count the number of zeros, and that represents the number of place values after the decimal point. If it's a fraction, it says there has to be a decimal point. So I've got my decimal point. There's 1 0, so that's 1 place value, and I usually draw it out just so I don't forget how many place values I have to account for. And then when I have that, I write my numerator in the blank. This is actually fairly simple. So 3 tenths in fraction form is 0.3. These are all the same thing. This is the model, this is fraction, this is decimal form. So that is what we did on the first day, and that was dated, let me see the date. That was December the 11th lesson. I haven't been able to put a video up recently. I want to get them all put up there. So this is what we did on December the 11th. And when I upload the video, I will put taught on December the 11th so that the kids can look at this and make sure they have it. When we come back from break, they will have the continuation of this unit, and we will have the test probably at the end of the week or the beginning of the following next week, just so that you have an idea of when they'll be testing. So this is what we did. So we had to convert decimals and fractions into decimals and decimals into fractions. So let me get into that section so we can put up a couple of examples and we can get some practice in here. The standard says that they should be able to take that fraction form and turn it into a decimal form, but also to convert from a decimal form back to a fraction form. So they have to be able to do either of those items. So let me just get into the book so I can get some examples. All right, so if I have 9/10 and I need to change this into a decimal, which is what my standard says I can do, it's a fraction that requires a decimal point. There's 1 0. 1 0 requires 1 place value. And then I just write my numerator in the blank. For tenths, it's really easy, and the kids honestly don't mess this up very often. They're pretty good at this because it is simple. It's 1 place value and write the number that's there at the top. All right, we also talked about using a number line to put things on a place value. So let me go ahead and get this here to change from a decimal point. So here we have, let's say we have 1 1/10. Now it would still be in tenths because we are changing to 10 here. This is 2. So this would be 1 2/10, 1 3/10, 1 4/10, 1 5/10, 1 6/10. The children know how to do a number line. You count the number of dashes that represents your denominator, and then it starts at 1 and then moves on. 1 7/10, 1 8/10, 1 9/10, and then 1 10/10 would be 2 wholes. All right, so now we need to use this to change our fraction into a decimal, and we want to show that the relationship is the same. That's the number line, is to show that the relationship or the place that it goes on the number line is the same. So when I have 1 1/10, this is a whole, so it goes before the decimal point. So I'm going to put a decimal point because there is a fraction. And I actually usually do my fractions first. It's just easier for me. I start with the smaller value and work my way to the left using the larger value. I have 1 0, so that represents 1 place value. My numerator goes in the place value spot. And then my wholes go prior to. So 1 1/10 is equivalent to 1.1, which would make this 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and so on. So it would look the same way. So even if you have a mixed number, and remember a mixed number is a whole number and a fraction together, even if you have that, it's the same thing. Whole numbers go prior to, so that might be a note that the kids want to write down. Whole numbers to the left of decimal. Fractions to the right. And remember, now I have seen students do this. They've done 1.1/10. That is incorrect. And I have seen kids do that because of this note. the note is just to help you understand where each part goes, but you still have to do the decimal conversion. So this is incorrect. I just want to put that there. But I have seen students do this. We need to definitely make sure that they understand. This just tells us where in the realm of how things look, where they should go. Maybe this might help. Whole numbers. And then if I put here decimal conversion, maybe that'll help so we don't have students doing this, because I have seen that before. All right, some examples of things. So we have 6 and 7/10. 6 and 7/10. So looking at my conversion here, looking at my setup, I should have whole numbers, decimal point, and decimal conversions. So I always put my decimal point because that is where basically our directions say we have to look, is at decimal point. Then I'm going to do take care of my fraction. I have 1 0, 1 place value, and I always write that just to keep myself so I don't forget a number or forget a space. It's really important to get in that habit, especially if you're not significantly strong in math. This helps keep you together. If you are strong in math, you don't have to draw out the lines. If you remember it, you'll remember it. But some children, this really helps them keep themselves in line. So 1 0, 1 place value. Numerator goes in that place value spot, and whole numbers go before. 6.7. So 6 and 7/10 becomes 6.7. Let me go ahead and put a few examples on here so that you have something to practice, and then we will end our video for today. So I've got 5/10. Tenths, or fraction, means a decimal point. 1 place value because there's 1 0, and then the number goes in there. 4 and 3/10. 4 and 3/10. Decimal point, I always start with that. 1 place value, 1 0. And I have a whole number, so I'm going to put, and I have 1 whole number, so I put that place value there. Each whole number represents its own place value. That's a 1s. If it was 14, there would be a 10s and a 1s because the 1 would go in the 10s place. 6/10. 19 and 2/10. 7/10. 1 and 8/10. So there's a few problems for practice. Let me zoom in on those a little bit so you can, ooh, that's a little too much. There we go. So we've got 5/10 here. We've got 6/10 here, 7/10 here, 4 and 3/10 here, 19 and 2/10 here, and 1 and 8/10. Hope this video helps. Again, this is what the kids learned on December the 11th. Thanks for watching, everybody.